A few weeks ago, my daughter reached a very important milestone in many young people's lives. She got her license, and now it's time to teach her how to drive. I don't know about you, but I couldn't wait to drive. I got my license as quickly as I could, and I haven't stopped driving since. I love driving, which is a good thing because I commute to London. My commute is a good hour and 20 minutes each way. I've also done countless road trips. I've driven to the West Coast and the East Coast. I eventually will drive to the Arctic Circle. And the reality is, it's now on me to try to teach my daughter how to drive safely, how to be able to pay attention. Get the fuck out of my way! Come on! Where did you learn to drive? There's nobody there. There's nobody there. The reality is that one of the things I need to teach my daughter is how to not rage while she's driving. How to drive and maintain her cool. And the reality is that for some, what I just did would constitute road rage. You know, honking the horn at someone is deemed as an aggressive behavior. But is it? Like, the reality is that I actually kind of like talking with my horn every once in a while. You know, when I pass bikers, hey, how's it going? We can communicate. That's the purpose of the horn. And sometimes there's people that might need a little bit of a reminder that what they did wasn't super smart. My kids don't particularly care for this, but every once in a while I feel like there's something really important conveyed by a really firm.
The World Health Organization defines health as a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. We've discussed this earlier in the term. Am I unhealthy because I don't have a complete state of physical well-being? Like, I have a herniated disc that's impacted my right side. I currently have very little voice as a consequence of a cold that's lingered. And I think lingered because potentially of long COVID, or at a minimum, the fact that we know COVID reduces our immunity and impairs our immune system. We let a disease run rampant without regard to how it might affect our physical well-being. Now, I guess I am unhealthy in a sense, because you can identify that my voice is hoarse, or you might see me limp. But a lot of the things we talk about when it comes to mental health are unseen, right? We don't see how someone may be afflicted. It may manifest in ways that are apparent.
Get the fuck out of my way, come on!
But what does it mean to have a complete state of mental well-being? So what do you do when you're not in a complete state of mental well-being, which I suspect for many isn't all that frequent? Think about just the stress of exams or finding a job or any other thing that may be on your mind. And these days there seems to be a lot of things that maybe are bothering people. Me, whenever I'm not feeling great mentally, I like to have a fire. I find fires restorative. I like everything about a fire, from stacking wood to cooking on it, to just staring into the coals or watching the smoke waft through the air. Fire for me is medicine, and it's restorative, and it's helpful. It brings me back to a place where I feel like I'm myself. It may not fix all the problems, but it definitely does help. For me, fire is really important medicine. Am I trying too hard to chop? My example of road rage might be a tad trivial. And certainly I am not advocating for any sort of form of raging on the road. But the diagnosis of others that honking my horn or flipping someone off is raging sometimes gets under my skin. Like, you don't know me. Well, these are my kids I'm talking about, so kind of they do. But the reality is like, this is not rage. This is just me expressing myself in a way that makes sense to me. Recall from Nito and Kluklatch that the court said that Miss Nito didn't have to accept that she had a mental illness. She only had to accept that the manifestations of what other people might call a mental illness existed, right? That she showed the signs of what other people might call mental illness. So I suppose I can acknowledge that I may manifest what appears to be road rage to others by flipping someone off or honking my horn. But I only get to decide for myself. And this is really important when it comes to treatment, especially treatment for psychiatric conditions. And in the 2003 decision of Starson and Swayze, this really comes to the forefront. Mr. Starson had decided to stop taking his antipsychotic medications. By all accounts, he was a genius, and he felt that the medications were interfering with his ability to do his work. And the Supreme Court of Canada determined that he was capable of making that decision. Now, the reality is the psychiatrists disagreed. They didn't think it would be good for him. And maybe it's not good for me to flip off cars and mutter under my breath. But part of what autonomy means is that we respect the decisions that people make about themselves for themselves. One of the things that's really interesting about Starson and Swayze is that it's celebrated as a patient's rights kind of case because it upheld Mr. Starson's autonomy. But that autonomy came at a cost, because even though Mr. Starson was deemed capable of refusing the antipsychotic medication, it was also determined that he couldn't be released as he applied to be from the psychiatric facility because he posed a risk. And as a result, Mr. Starson spent 7 years in a psychiatric facility. And during that time, his condition deteriorated because he wasn't on his antipsychotic meds. Mr. Starson's psychosis developed to such a point that he believed the devil was torturing his imaginary son, and that the only way to prevent this was to not eat and drink. And ultimately, respecting his autonomy meant that Mr. Starson went without treatment and was deprived of liberty.
This case started at the Ontario Consent and Capacity Board. The board was charged with determining whether Professor Starson was incapable by reason of mental illness from consenting to treatment under the Healthcare Consent Act. And ultimately, it determined that he was incapable. The board held that he was in almost total denial of his illness and that he wasn't taking into account the consequences of refusing the treatment. The Ontario Superior Court of Justice overturned the board's decision, however, stating that it did not accurately apply the statutory test for capacity that exists in the Healthcare Consent Act. And this is ultimately what the court was considering at the Supreme Court. Now, fascinatingly, Professor Starson knew that he had mental health problems. He just didn't agree that it was an illness. Professor Starson needed, in his mind, his full mental capacity in order to do the scientific work he was engaged in. And here it wasn't just someone making up ideas. Professor Starson was recognized as a legitimate thinker in the field. He had published papers with professors from Stanford. And one of those professors said that Starson was 10 years ahead of his time. And even though he had no university training, his peers in the academic community allowed him to use the title of professor in recognition of the accomplishments. And Starson felt like the medication dulled his thinking and prevented him from working. And while he was happy in his life generally, he found that the medicine actually made him miserable. Justice Malloy of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, in reversing the decision of the board, found that the board had really no evidentiary foundation to support its findings that Professor Starson suffered from delusions, and that the board unreasonably disregarded evidence from his friends and colleagues, and it drew unsupported inferences to his activity based on hearsay and other things. And so ultimately, the court held the board failed to consider the extent to which the psychiatric disorder and alleged delusions actually affected his ability to understand information or appreciate the consequences, and that this amounted to a misapplication of the legal test for capacity. Now, the Ontario Court of Appeal ultimately agreed with this, and then this went, as we know, to the Supreme Court of Canada. And really importantly, the court starts by re-emphasizing Fleming and Reed, where the right to refuse unwanted medical treatment is fundamental to a person's dignity and autonomy, and noted that this right is equally important in the context of treatments for mental illness. Unwarranted findings of incapacity ultimately infringe on a person's right to self-determination. And the mandate of the board, the Supreme Court said, was to adjudicate solely upon a patient's capacity. Any conception of what was in the patient's best interest was irrelevant. And as the reviewing judge observed, a competent patient has an absolute entitlement to make decisions that any reasonable person would deem foolish. The court noted that the board equated the presence of a mental disorder with incapacity, but capacity involves two criteria: The first criteria is that a person must be able to understand the information that is relevant to making a treatment decision. This requires the cognitive ability, the court says, to process, retain, and understand the information. And here the court said there's no question that Professor Starson meets this criterion. The second part is that a person must be able to appreciate the reasonable, foreseeable consequences of the decision or the lack of one. And this means they have to be able to apply the relevant information to their specific circumstances and to be able to weigh those risks and benefits of the decision or the lack thereof. And that's where the board failed. It was based on their perceptions of Starson. The court also noted that patients don't need to agree with the diagnosis of a physician in order to be able to apply relevant information. And explicitly notes that psychiatry is not an exact science, nor is medicine, right? And that the capable but dissident interpretations of information are to be expected. And therefore, a patient is not required to describe his mental condition as an illness or to characterize the condition in negative terms. That's an imposition from others. And while the road rage example may be kind of silly, I thought it would illustrate that sometimes people may accuse someone of something or project onto them their sense of what it might mean, but that doesn't have to be accepted. A patient is not required to agree with the physician's opinion, even regarding the causes of the condition. If the patient's condition results in them being unable to recognize that they're affected by it, then they will be unable to apply that information and unable to appreciate the consequences. So the act requires only that a patient have the ability to appreciate the consequences of the decision. It does not require actual appreciation of these consequences. And the court says this distinction may be subtle, but it's important. In practice, capacity really begins with an inquiry into the patient's actual appreciation of the parameters. And if they can show an appreciation of the parameters, regardless of how they weigh or value that information, they have the ability to appreciate the decision being made. A patient's lack of appreciation may derive from causes that do not necessarily undermine the ability to appreciate consequences. So, for example, the court notes a lack of appreciation may reflect the attending physician's own failures to adequately inform the patient of the decision's consequences. And so it's imperative that when determining this, that you have to look at the reasons for the patient's failure to appreciate consequences. As the court notes, a finding of incapacity is justified only if those reasons demonstrate that the patient's mental disorder prevents him from having the ability to appreciate the foreseeable consequences of the decision. Starson didn't want to be on the medicine because he said it would be worse than death for me. I have always considered normal to be a term so boring it would be like death. He had no interest. He understood. It's apparent that Starson valued his ability to do his work as a physicist above all else, and that he viewed the cure proposed by the physicians as more damaging than the disorder. The board's task was to determine the patient's mental capacity. The wisdom of whether Professor Starson's treatment decision is not relevant to that determination. If Starson is capable, he's entitled to make a decision, even if everyone else perceives that as foolish. And here, the court noted the board improperly allowed its own conception of Starson's best interest to influence its finding of incapacity. A key takeaway from this case is that a patient's failure to recognize consequences does not necessarily reflect an inability to appreciate consequences. And this is that subtle but critical distinction. People, hey, huh, hey, hey, hey.
Ghost loves the cemetery. I know, it's quite poetic. When we're walking here, I often think about what led people to be here. Some of the people in this cemetery are young. Some died tragically. The reality is some are here because they did not appreciate the consequences of their decision. But Starson stands for the proposition that it's not about appreciating the consequences. It's the ability to understand the consequences. And so it's really critically important that when we think about a right to make a decision in healthcare, that we don't construe best interest with capacity. Because the best interest standard is only really relevant when someone can't make a decision for themselves. As long as they have the ability to, the capacity to, even if it leads them here, they're allowed to make it.